Yeah, so like I never had these conversations with my dad about like being vulnerable or how I'm feeling. My upbringings were keeping everything inside until I eventually like lose it or I break down. So that would also affect my closest relationships as well, which is not fair to like those around me.
Hey, this is Sugar Honey Bubble Tea, a podcast aimed to amplify Asian women voices through critical thinking and meaningful conversations. I am your host, Ange, and today we're not only talking about amplifying Asian women voices, we are amplifying men's voices, Asian men in particular. So before we start today's episode, again, we do this every week. Please go follow us on Instagram at SugarHoneyBBT. That's SugaHoneyBBT. We post a lot of podcast episode related segments every week, and there's music, much more. And yeah, you can see our faces. It will be fun. And please leave us a 5-star review on Apple. It does bump us up in the rankings on Apple. And also PayPal us, donation to us. It's one of the best ways to support independent creators, especially someone I'm talking to today as a guest is also an independent creator. And also one of the other best way to support us is Patreon. It's a monthly subscription service where you get different perks. You can get either sticker packs or bonus contents being added onto our close friends. So anyways, without further ado, let's start today's episode. As you can see, it's just me today. And why is that? Because today I'm interviewing our first ever guest. And today's topic is something that Toby and I have been wanting to talk about for a while now. But we haven't done it because we can't do the topic justice, because we want to talk about male emotions and vulnerability in regards of race, culture. And it's something that, because Toby and I are not men, so we wanted to have someone who identifies as a man to share their experience and their perspective with us. And today our guest is someone that's a dear friend of mine, very talented, and it's someone that I love having conversations with. And I've always had really, really great coffee conversations with this person. And I can't wait for you guys to hear his perspective on this topic. And I would say our friendship really stemmed from our shared interest in connecting spirituality with psychology and sociology and pretty much the overall human experience. So without further ado, our guest, first and ever guest on Sugar Honey Bubble Tea, is my dear friend Ryan. Ryan Maeland.
Hi, Ange.
How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing great. This is also my first time being on a podcast ever, so it's kind of nerve-wracking at the same time. So thank you for this experience as well.
Thank you for being here.
Disclaimer, I might be somewhat nervous as well. So if you hear occasionally stuttering or me thinking out loud, please bear with me here. But anyways, I'm glad to be on here.
Briefly tell our listeners who you are.
So my name is Ryan. I am a creative consultant and I am partner at an associate studio. Basically, I run the studio with my now partner, Marzi, as well, which is how I met you guys and your sister. So basically what we do is we provide creative solutions to brands and institutions, like-minded, of course. Basically what brand experience means is that it's more a full circle, whereas we start with branding projects. We also do websites as well. We do marketing activations, all that lot. And basically, my trajectory culminated. I was in the States. I was born here, but then later on moved to this Southern California, and I was brought up there, and then moved back when I was when I was around in high school. And I've been here in Taipei, Taiwan ever since.
mainly your job as running and associates studio is helping brands basically understand themselves, so you better identify where they are placed in the market.
So one of the most important aspects of what we do and what I do at our agency slash studio is we work with our partners or our clients on their underlying strategy, which also means unraveling their core values and who they are who they are at the core. So I feel like it's equally important to find out like who you are, understand yourself in order to help others do the same for themselves and what the story they're trying to convey to their market and their audience as well.
And what you do is really that's untraditional compared to other people in the industry, is that you and your partner bring spirituality into the branding aspect.
I would say so, yeah, because one of our core ethos is we look to a brand not as another product or byproduct of any creations of sorts, but we look to a brand as a full-on universe where everything we do is about value, and without value, without uncovering, your brand is basically another brand, and it's really meaningless. And we don't really work with brands these days that, you know, are simply doing it to make money or generate income, because it doesn't make sense for us or me on a personal note to create another meaningless brand that conveys zero value. And that's why we are here to build these bridges and make warm connections, build connections that people can, you know, have conversations about, and that narrative can be passed on. So
you talked about having to understand yourself so you can do the same for others, and that linking to our topic today. How do you come to understand what emotions and vulnerabilities mean to you?
Well, you know, what's interesting is that emotions and vulnerability isn't something, I mean, it's always been a long stay since we were brought up as children, as we were like growing up. But vulnerability, on the other hand, isn't something that is taught or given to us, but rather something you figure out like as time goes on, like as like these experiences that you go through, you discover more about yourself. But then it also goes back to being vulnerable also helps with you being more emotionally open. Emotions and vulnerability, they go hand in hand. And it's still to this day for me a tricky topic, because not only because it's a topic that varies from person to person and it isn't something that's seen under the same light. And so, but for me, like, I'm only able to be emotionally open or available when I am vulnerable.
You touched on how you were born in Taiwan but raised in Western, with Western influence in Southern California, right?
Yeah.
How do you think your culture and race plays into that?
It's kind of interesting because sometimes it kind of contradicts with each other, because being like having the Western sensibilities, like growing up in a Western environment, we were, you know, our environment was really free flowing growing up, and being in an Asian household, like there were certain specs, basically restrictions
Or expectations of what you need to be.
Yeah, you need to have good grades in order to be, you know, someone, or having a certain identity, and
Or an identity being imposed on you.
yeah. But then it was an identity crisis thing, like growing up. Like, should I be this or should I embody both? But then like there were so many restrictions growing up that I felt most of my childhood and in my youth, I was really struggling to get certain things out or touch on certain topics, like especially with close relationships.
Like immediate family members.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something till this day that I still struggle with. But I am still learning. But where I am now, I'm extremely grateful and appreciative of the lessons that have been brought into my life and where I'm at now. Because now at this day and age, like I'm 28, turning 29. I'm about to enter this new chapter in my life, and I've become more aware than I've ever been in my life. And at the end of the day, like, I don't really subscribe to what the cultural or collective, consciousness portray onto me anymore. Which also means that what people or society tells me on a collective level, like, I don't really subscribe to that anymore, because I am now more aware than I have ever been. So I know that there's a certain amount of existence of XYZ topic, but I choose to recognize it. But it's also like I'm standing on a platform waiting for a train. But then when that train comes, it also leaves as well. So
very metaphorical.
Yeah, it's very metaphorical and very philosophical. And
so what do you mean by when that train comes, you're also on the leave as well?
So like it's kind of like looking at it from a different perspective. It's sort of like, reading a book, but you are the character in that book. You can see what's going on, and you can see that it's happening, and see that what the content of the books are, what it's trying to tell you. But you can also choose not to relate with it and sort of detach from it in a way.
When you talked about like the cultural sense of what definition of masculinity means nothing to you at this point of life. Can you briefly talk about like what masculinity meant to you when you were growing up, in your upbringing, whether it may be societal expectations of you or your family expectations of you? What does that look like when you were growing up? Like, did you ever have that conditioning that you need to be the specific identity or the specific stereotype of what a masculine man means?
I used to, like, I say this in full transparency, like I used to want to be someone, or like when I was growing up, I wanted to be a person that would make my parents proud, or especially my dad. I would want to make him proud. Like I would go on to study English literature just because he wanted that for me. But then like he would want me to also become this person that would dive into economics.
Like his expectations of you.
Yeah, because he is a businessman at the end of the day. And he would also want that for me because he also grew up in an environment where he was also struggling, like to make money for the whole household, right? To
like
put
the
a
breadwinner.
roof, the breadwinner, the person who would basically build the house for us and have a roof over our heads. And I used to want to be like that as well, because I felt like that was my upbringing. That was how I feel like I would have to sacrifice on a somewhat level to be a certain character in this movie or this play.
Yes.
But nowadays, like growing up, like being a rebel at heart, like I don't really like to follow rules. So like even though like I was studying English literature and all that stuff. I ended up like failing school just because I wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to have a career in design. So I extended my studies, like, you know, how like we go to college for 4 years. I went to college for 6 years because I was failing school. But then
Because you didn't want to do it.
because I didn't want to like go to school. Like this doesn't make any sense to me. Like I don't have to be this. I don't have to have a diploma to, you know, to stroke my ego.
During your upbringing, and especially in under an Asian household with an Asian father, and you did say that you wanted to be the kind of person that he expected you to be. Did he ever taught you about emotions, or how did he view vulnerability, or how because he's like a male figure in your life, when you look at him or any male figure in your life when you were growing up, any of that influence you to be not that? You know, how did you break out of wanting to be that person? Because you said you wanted to do that. You wanted to be that breadwinner of the family, or however we, you know, traditionally male stereotypes, you know, operate within like a larger structure of a gender paradigm. And for especially Asian men to be masculine, they're expected to display attributes such as like strength or power, competitiveness, especially towards another man, or, you know, less openly displaying their emotions or affections. Like I never saw my dad, you know, being affectionate towards my mom or anyone in his life, because he's so conditioned in his ways to not do that, right?
Yeah.
So if you continue on the road of becoming what your father expected you to be, that would have kind of be what you would be, right? What I just kind of mentioned on the stereotypes. So how did you break out of that to be like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that. What inspired you?
First things first, looping back to what I said at the very beginning, like vulnerability and emotions, like freely expressing your emotions isn't something that is taught. So, and number two, my dad is like a full-on Taurus. So he everything is internal.
And you're a Libra.
And I am a Libra. So like I didn't have the closest relationship with my dad like ever.
And it's not a common thing to have a very close relationship with your father in Asian households.
Yeah, it's
very uncommon to.
Yeah. Like it's groundbreaking, like for me to just know like, oh, this person gets along with their dad. Oh, wow.
I know. It's insane.
It's mind blowing for me. Like growing up, like I think
I look at my white friends and I'm like, how do you have that relationship with your father? Like it's nearly impossible in Asian communities. It is not nearly impossible. I shouldn't say that as a whole, but you know, if you're an Asian, you know, like male father figures in Asian household have this very like on a pedestal. They're up here. You do and say whatever I want you to do and say. So it's really hard to have that kind of like intimacy and close relationship with someone with such power.
Yeah, so like I never had these conversations with my dad about like being vulnerable or how I'm feeling at that time and place.
Absolutely,
so, you know, I think how it also ties back to like how he was brought up as well. Like how his parents showed him love was through sacrifice, and like because he really struggled as a kid and he really suppressed himself growing up. I mean, as far as I know, like what my mom has told me about my dad. And so that like my upbringings were keeping everything inside until I eventually like lose it or I break down. So that would also affect my closest relationships as well, which is not fair to like those around me. And nowadays it's I've improved, like I've grown out of that. Like I've become more aware of like certain emotions that I'm going through or things that I'm dealing with. Nowadays it's still tough for me to express them, and that's something that I'm still navigating through and maneuvering through. So
I like what you said about you talked a lot about your family, and for me, one of the biggest thing is that, and not only I look at the family or male figures in my family, whether it's my father, my siblings, etc. I also look at the female figures in my family and how they deal with the men in their life. And I was reading this book called Boys and Sex by Peggy Orenstein. She's an award-winning journalist. And in the book for 2 years, Peggy interviews adolescent men, and so young boys, and their relationship to sex and the struggle with toxic masculinity, kind of what we just touched on just now, about strength and power and all these stereotypes. And in the book, there's a 2018 survey that surveyed 1,000 U.S. adolescents, and they found that young men who strongly identifies with male stereotypes were 6 times, and I say 6 times, more likely to report harassing women or harassing girls and bullying other boys. And so it really got me to think, and when I look at the women in my family, how they have suffered from the toxic masculinity of the men in their life. And I know this is a very strong statement, and I know not all men are like this, but when men don't know how to deal with their emotions and vulnerability, it directly affects the people closest to them, whether it's men, whether it's other men, their children, their parents, or it's their other half. It's a bit of a struggle for me to watch, especially with me having a Western influence. So what do you think, how does, in your experience or what you have seen, how does the lack of male emotions and the traditional gender norm of masculinity affects women, either in your personal life or, as in the society as a whole?
This is a really great question. And this is honestly, this is something that I have never thought about. We on this planet, both male, female, or whatever, societal these boundaries that that were taught,
these identities that were being put,
these barriers or these blockages, they coexist with each other. So it's sort of like male and female, and there's this equal sign in between. So if anything happens on the male side, it's definitely going to affect the other side, and vice versa.
Duality.
Yeah, it's duality. And I've been talking to this with my girlfriend about how duality is the number 2 is actually the number 1. Yeah, it's just this thought that I had a couple weeks back, and if both people imagine if both people are in a bubble or something, somehow someone is going to affect someone some way. I think being the black sheep of the house, I always knew what I wanted, and I know the importance of the female character in my life. I have many close female friends, so I could feel their struggles, with their relationships with men, whether close relationships or on a friendship level, or their relationships with their fathers. That also comes down to being aware of how you treat other people. Male emotions, I feel have been suppressed for so long. And I think it's because of due to the recent pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, people have really sat down with themselves, especially of if you identify as a male, this is the first time where you really had to sit with yourself and have conversations with yourself. Whereas, everything is coming into light, the hard emotions, the challenging emotions that you've had in the past, where you could repress yourself through external forms, whether it be through alcohol, drugs, work, or whatever. And now, with restrictions, especially I'm fortunate enough to not have that. I didn't have to go through lockdown.
Taiwan is one of the most fortunate country to not have to go through the extent that other countries have gone through in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. So like if you were out west, I feel like that was, I guess that was like a really difficult time for people to be with themselves, especially if you identify as a male.
Yeah, and especially like the stats, I mean, don't quote me on the exact stats, but I know divorce rates went up during the lockdown. Domestic violence also went up during the lockdown, because people either, like you said, were identifying themselves with these external validations that when they no longer have that, they have to sit with themselves and what is really going on inside. It's sometimes a very difficult task for a lot of people who aren't used to that. And therefore, it be expressed in ways that maybe, like you said, drugs, alcohol, violence, etc. And that's going back to what we were talking about, how it affects women and of course men as well. But, you know, vice versa, right? Like, how does that toxic masculinity and not being able to express your emotions really affect the people around you? And you can't really talk about toxic masculinity or masculinity as a whole without talking about ego. What does ego mean to you? And this is such a big topic, I know. Yeah. But what does ego mean to you? And how does your ego and masculinity affect your relationships?
Ego is just the consciousness as a whole. So, before, like, if we talk about ego, the first thing I think about is my recent like research, and like I've been doing a lot of research on psychotherapy as well, because I'm just like it's something that I like naturally gravitated towards because
it's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, so like we both are on our own individual like spirituality paths, like spiritual paths, and I found it interesting to go about it through the angle of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, like basically through a scientific perspective, like through people like Adler, Freud, Jung, and all that lot. And the philosophy that I leaned more towards to was the Jungian philosophy, where he talks a lot about the ego. And so if you look at it from a total perspective, like the ego is basically the consciousness before you dive into the subconscious. So the ego is your thoughts, your emotions, this identity of this person you want to be in this reality world. And basically, ego, being this projection, is also something that is an illusion.
So ego is an illusion to you.
So ego is an illusion, but it's also very, very real. Because people can also be overrun by ego. They can also be, swayed back and forth by your ego. So if, for instance, if you're having an argument with someone, you can go about it from the perspective of your ego or who you really are at the core.
Because sometimes, like, I find that when I'm going to use couples relationship as an example, when you have an argument with someone, with your other half, it's not that sometimes it's not about the actual argument or the problem that you're trying to solve. It's really two egos trying to win that argument. It's for the sake of arguing and not for the sake of solving the problem. And I've always said, like, the problem is the devil, not each other. Each other is just ego. So solve the problem together. The problem is the devil, not the argument. And there's this thing, there's this example I can think of where I recently, I'm going to talk about my emotions now, like as a female.
Sure.
That when I go through these ups and downs of emotional waves, and first of all, like you briefly mentioned about awareness earlier, that being aware of your emotions or your identity or how you're feeling, etc. Like I have this awareness now that I can feel that there's going to be a big wave coming, the turbulence coming, right? And I can feel that first wave, and I know there's going to be a tsunami that follows. And so how I deal with my emotions is that I let my partner know that, hey, something is about to come, and I just want you to know it's not about you. It's probably not even about me. It's just this emotion that I need to let it pass. And when it does pass, we'll be okay. But, it's kind of like a heads up, like informing you that it will, that, not to take anything so personal and, we'll be okay kind of thing. And I think that's one way when we talk about how ego and masculinity affect relationships or emotions affect a relationship, like sometimes it's just about putting that ego aside and seeing the problem as the problem is.
Yeah, just recognizing that this does exist. Like I said, like it does exist. It's just the amount of like how much you want to bring it into that conversation / argument. Because our consciousness is, like I said, is also an illusion, but I'm not saying it as like an illusion is not real. Like an illusion, you can still see it.
Because it's a collective illusion. I mean, we talk about this a lot, but that's kind of like a sidetrack, like how society is an illusion because it's collective.
It's just the level and amount you want to bring that in, because it also talks about being responsible for yourself and responsible for like your actions, like taking accountability into every single thing that you do or say, because these are conversations that I also have with my girlfriend all the time. Like we both know that these aren't real. Like thoughts and emotions, these are just projections. These aren't real. They're not yours. So learning about its existence, but also unlearning, like for me, it happens simultaneously. And
that's very powerful. Like the part where you talk about how it's about unlearning, and it's also about redefining, I think, how all these terms that we learn to know or conditioned to learn to be are just things that, like you said, are illusions. And it's something that the society has put us on, and we collectively all see it as truth. But what is the real truth? And I think that gets into a much deeper philosophical or spiritual question. So let's end this first part of the interview. And as you know, sometimes when I get into really, really good conversations, I do 2 parts. So this is going to be a 2-part series. And next week, you can come back and listen to more about male emotions and vulnerability with Ryan. And I love having you have this conversation with you. So where can our listeners find you?
andassociates.com. That's and-associates.com. And our Instagram is and2_ and associates.
I'll tag all that. And also you can find me and Toby on Sugar Honey Bubble Tea on Instagram. That's SUGAHONEYBBT. And, you can listen to the rest of our podcasts on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you listen to your podcast, pretty much. And please, if you're very interested in this topic, come back next week and we can talk more on male emotions and vulnerability with Ryan.